John Kelly, if you don't know him, he is the New England director of Not Dead Yet, but he's also Second Thoughts Massachusetts. And so, John, the time is yours.
Hey, thank you very much, Alex. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone who's gathered. My name is John Kelly, and I am a white man sitting up in bed with glasses. My head is resting on a brown pillow, and I have a contraption in front of me. And my pronouns are he, his, and him. So the title of my talk is Impact of Assisted Suicide Legislation on Disabled and BIPOC Communities. BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. Next slide, please. Not Dead Yet Origin and Issues. Not Dead Yet is the leading national disability rights group opposed to assisted suicide laws, futility judgments, mercy killing, and better dead than disabled messages as forms of deadly disability discrimination. We were founded in 1996 in the context of 2 Jack Kevorkian acquittals and a couple of Supreme Court cases. It later came out in the New England Journal of Medicine that 2/3 of Kevorkian's victims were not terminal. People, mostly women, with disabilities under terrible stress. Then, and it continues to this day, the media conflates or mixes up terminally ill with disability. Disabled people are the natural leaders against assisted suicide. Next slide. So I'm someone who in common day language is paralyzed from the neck down, just like the character played by Sam Claflin in Me Before You. Popular culture romanticizes the death of people like me from films like Whose Life Is It Anyway, $1 Million Baby, The Sea Inside, and the 2016 hit Me Before You. People are taught that lives like mine are a humiliating burden calling out for death. And then we have a snapshot of a poster we made. Go back, please. It reads, Me Before You is not a romance. It's a disability snuff movie, giving audiences the message that if you're a disabled person, you're better off dead. Okay, next. Assisted suicide, it's all about disability. People with terminal conditions are or will soon become disabled and form a subset of the vast disability population. As leading assisted suicide proponent Lonnie Shabelson has said, it's almost never about pain. It's about dignity and control. Bioethicist Thaddeus Pope, in a 2020 debate with me, said, quote, everybody who's using medical aid in dying is disabled. And probably you could go to the next step and say, the reason they want medical aid in dying is because of their disability. So that's a true statement. But I guess the key thing is that's their judgment, right? Some people would say, I find this condition intolerable. Other people won't. So with assisted suicide, the state sets itself up as an approver of people dying because they're disabled. Next, please. People with serious illnesses and terminal conditions are disabled. It shows a Venn diagram with people with disabilities and a big oval and then a little circle inside, people with terminal conditions. Next. Reported reasons for assisted suicide in Oregon, this is all years. Loss of autonomy, 91%. Decreasing ability to participate in activities, 90%. A loss of dignity, in other words, humiliation and embarrassment, 74%. Emotional or physical burden, 48%. It's an outrage that states will approve people's suicides because they feel like a burden on other people. The loss of control of bodily functions like incontinence and vomiting, And then that's 43%. Inadequate pain control or concern about it. The first 2 years, they had pain as a separate category, but only one person fit the bill. So they decided to add more concern about it. So now we just have people being measured for their fear level. Next, please. Major U.S. national disability groups opposed to assisted suicide laws. ADAPT, American Association of People with Disabilities. Association of Programs for Rural Independent Living. Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, usually known as DREDF. National Council on Disability, which issued the landmark book against assisted suicide entitled The Danger of Assisted Suicide Laws. National Council on Independent Living, TASH, the ARC of the United States, and United Spinal Association. Next slide. Medical ableism. In a survey of 714 practicing U.S. physicians nationwide, over 82% reported that people with significant disability have worse quality of life than non-disabled people. These findings about physicians' perceptions of this population raise questions about ensuring equitable care to people with disability. Potentially biased views among physicians could contribute to persistent healthcare disparities affecting people with disability. And the lead author was Lisa Iazzoni, a disabled researcher at Harvard. Next slide. COVID-19 and crisis standards of care. Old, ill, and disabled people most affected. Thousands of people died in nursing homes. The COVID the whole time we've been in the pandemic, it's been framed as, quote, we don't need to worry. It's just those other people, the old and the immunocompromised. Right after the pandemic started, public health doctors rushed to devise crisis standards of care to triage disabled people away from care. States used 5-year survival rates estimations, quality of life indicators. Some states announced plans to take away people's ventilators to give to people thought more likely to survive. So my colleague Diane Coleman in New York, she has a ventilator. If she went to the ER, she would risk having them take her personal property away from her and give it to someone that they thought had a better chance of survival. COVID-19 has killed Black, Indigenous, and people of color at higher rates than whites. And then disability rights advocates worked alongside civil rights advocates to make the crisis standards a little more fair. Next, please. It's also assisted suicide is also all about race, class, and ethnicity. A 2013 Pew Research Center study shows that Blacks oppose assisted suicide by 65% to 29%, while Latinos are opposed 65% to 32%. In California, it's 94%. The group's population share is 39%. Interesting finding from the 2012 referendum in Massachusetts was that working class white towns in Massachusetts also voted heavily against assisted suicide. So what we have is it's divided by class, by race, by ethnicity, and by prejudice against disabled people. Next, please. Systemic racism, racial disparities. Due to racial disparities in our healthcare system, Blacks are the sickest patients waiting for organ transplants, yet often die waiting. Blacks are diagnosed with cancer at much later stages, and the prognosis is worse. Black people get inferior diabetes care with more amputations. Next slide. Medical racism. In a recent study of 1 million children with appendicitis in emergency rooms around the country, Black children were 1/5 as likely to receive opioid painkillers for their severe pain as white children. White children received opiates 5 times more than Black children. In a 2016 study, 1/3 of 222 white medical students and residents surveyed held the false belief that Blacks had a higher tolerance for pain and thicker skins like animals. Next slide. How do racial disparities in healthcare relate to assisted suicide? Blacks are at risk because racial disparities in healthcare lead to limited health choices and poorer health outcomes, make it more likely that doctors will write off patients as terminal, make it less likely that patients can afford life-saving treatment, make it less likely that patients will receive adequate pain treatment, like those children I just mentioned. Next, please. Racial disparities. Michael Hickson, who was a 46-year-old Morehouse graduate who had, with his wife Melissa and 5 teenage children. In 2015, he had a cardiac arrest, an hypoxic episode, and brain injury. He contacted COVID-19 and he was taken to the hospital where a doctor told wife Melissa that Michael has no quality of life. It would be futile to treat him and that it is in his best interests to die. Next slide. Quality of life. So as of now, the doctor said, his quality of life, he doesn't have much of one. What do you mean, Melissa replied? Because he's paralyzed with a brain injury, doesn't have quality of life? Correct, the doctor replied. Michael was never asked himself whether he wanted to live. The hospital refused to treat him, and he died some days later. The hospital ignored Melissa's calls. Melissa later said, he would say, I want to live. I love my family and my children. They're the most important things to me. He would probably say that's the reason for the past 3 years I have fought to survive. Next, please. Culture clash, individual versus the family. This doctor is part of the same mostly white professional class that supports and uses assisted suicide. I believe individual autonomy, achievement, and status matter most, summed up with that word dignity. Melissa and the children who FaceTime with Michael the last day she saw him believe in family, connection, obligation, and sacrificing for others. Professional class proponents want the state to promote the individual over the family group, a form of cultural and class domination. Suicide is much less a part of Black and Latino culture. White suicide is more than twice the rate of Black and Latino communities. Next, please. All right, here are some of our arguments, such as real choice belongs to insurers who can deny prescribed treatments at will. Legalization makes assisted suicide a quote-unquote medical treatment, which gets coverage while traditional life-saving treatments get denied. In Oregon, you can qualify as terminal if you can't afford your treatment or if treatment stops for any reason. Like assisted suicide, use of hospice and advanced directives are also pushed at BIPOC and marginalized people. Cost cutting is the key. Next, please. Example, Dr. Brian Callister's patients. He had 2 patients that needed an expensive but routine procedure. The insurance companies he was dealing with, though, refused to cover the treatment and only offered hospice and assisted suicide. Next. Elder and disability abuse. 1 in 10 elders is abused every year. It'd be easy to encourage someone. You can pick up the lethal drugs and even administer them because there's no witness required at the death. Next, please. Trust kills. Non-terminal people are dying. In 2020, Oregon finally admitted that over all years, 4% of all patients who got lethal prescriptions outlived their 6-month prognosis. But since studies show that 12 to 15% of people who enter hospice outlive 6 months, 91% of Oregon deaths were in hospice, that means that up to 10% of program deaths were the result of wrong prognoses. Next, please. Okay, and then we have solutions. Palliative care, more widely available and better. It should be a required medical school study area. Expand hospice services, around 1 to 2 hours per day. Fully funded home care to remove the problem of being a burden. It should be funded for everyone, rich and poor alike. Suicide prevention outreach to elders and disabled, and finally recognize the equal dignity of everyone. If I could skip the next slide. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Oh, I'll just go back to that one. Summary. Under assisted suicide, some people will lose their lives through insurance denials, persuasion, coercion, abuse, misdiagnosis, and unequal access to medical treatments. No safeguards have ever been enacted or even proposed that can prevent this outcome, which could never be undone. Thank you very much. That concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much, John. And so the next presenter is Peter Wolfgang, and he's going to talk about the work they've done in Connecticut to prevent the passage of assisted suicide laws in his state.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you for having me as one of your speakers in this webinar. You all heard 2 fantastic speakers so far, and they really set the bar high. I will try to live up to that. I only have about 6 or 7 points that I want to make. So let me just, I'm going to time myself to make sure I don't go over. As Alex said, my name is Peter Wolfgang. I am the executive director of the Family Institute of Connecticut. And, you know, you heard from Alex, you heard the overall lay of the land regarding assisted suicide, where we stand in matters right now legally. You heard some very powerful, concrete reasons from John Kelly for why assisted suicide is a bad thing. What I'm going to talk about is some of the do's and don'ts in terms of how we lobby this issue. As Alex said, we've lobbied this for several years in the state of Connecticut. We've been for nearly a decade now, and we picked up some ideas along the way. Look, 7 points, they overlap. The first thing I want to say is I know there are many people on the webinar right now who are, for instance, members of the Family Institute of Connecticut or similar organizations. We are what the media would call social conservatives. And that's kind of a bit of a trap that you have to keep your eye on when you're arguing this issue, because we come to this issue with certain motivations, and there's nothing wrong with that, but there is something wrong with a lack of messaging discipline. And that's the sort of thing you want to be careful about. So what you want to do when you argue the assisted suicide issue is you want to stick to the topic. You don't want to be distracted. There is nothing the other side would like more than to knock you off your messaging discipline and get you to talk about these other things. So when we approach the assisted suicide issue, be very careful about this. This is not pro-life versus pro-choice. This is not religion versus secularism. This is not liberal versus conservative. We'll break that down in a moment, why it's not those things. But what I want to warn you about at the onset is to stay away from that culture war box. That's what the other side wants to do. They want to put you into that box, especially when we're fighting this in certain states with a particular political background. If you're in a blue state, there's nothing they would love more than to get you talking about those issues. You don't want to talk about those issues. You want to talk about the sort of issues that you just heard John Kelly talking about. And this goes to my next point. Whatever preconceived notions you may have lobbying other issues, whatever you may believe about from your previous experience about who your friends are, who your possible adversaries are, throw it out the window. Assisted suicide is a completely different issue. You want to come to this issue with fresh eyes. So for instance, Democrats who, may not be your friends on other issues, when you approach assisted suicide, you may be surprised. There are Democrats who, because of their communitarian ethic, because of their concern for the common good, are actually very open to the sort of arguments that you just heard from John Kelly, the sort of arguments that we should all be making. They understand naturally, a lot of them, that assisted suicide is bad public policy that puts vulnerable populations at risk. That's the way you want to talk about this issue. And I'm speaking in kind of generalities because I think you got more detail from John and from Alex, but that's the way you want to speak about this. It's bad public policy that puts vulnerable populations at risk. And then you can drill down. Alex just said something saying that he can send John slides. And I think that's very important for all of us. You all want to spend time. I know it's a little bit like drinking, from a fire hose these last 45 minutes, but please, at your leisure, pour over John's slides. They were fantastic. Pour over Alex's slides. These are very important. I can tell you as a sort of broad, big picture way to approach this, that's how you want to talk about it. It's bad public policy that puts vulnerable populations at risk, not those other things that I mentioned. Also, you may be surprised. You may find that Republicans who you might think would be on your side are actually not on your side sometimes because of that strong libertarian ethic that runs through much of the American right. That sense of individualism may actually open them up more to the pro-assisted suicide arguments. That's what we found. We found friends. I mean, those of us who have my kind of political background, who are socially conservative, we have found friends in places where we would not normally expect them. We found adversaries in places where we would not normally expect them. Now, you never want to give up on anybody. Everybody ought to be reachable. And there's arguments for the libertarian crowd too. There's arguments for people who, for whatever reason on the hard left, are in favor of assisted suicide. You've heard some of those arguments already. But what you want to do is tailor your argument to your audience and make sure it's your argument that's going to persuade them, not the other side trying to knock you off your talking points and getting you to talk about the sort of things that they would rather you talk about. So look, putting our allies in the disability community, I cannot possibly agree with John Kelly on this more. And John and I'm sure you could probably pick up, we probably have a lot of areas of disagreement on other matters. But on assisted suicide, there's absolutely no sunlight between us whatsoever. I can tell you, John is absolutely right. Based on my experience, what you want to do is put your friends in the disability community front and center. Many of these folks are progressive, they're left-leaning, and they are absolutely fantastic in fighting this issue. What you want to do is back them up. You want to put them out front. You want to support them. You want to have a tough skin. You may be moving in circles that you don't normally move in. You may hear things that will offend you. Let it go. Stick to the, in the civil rights movement, they had a phrase, eyes on the prize. That's what you want to do. You want to have your eyes on the prize. You want to stick to the goal, which is defeating assisted suicide. Keep your eyes on the prize. Third point, just as an aside, don't deny who you are. Everyone, if there's a certain dishonesty, deception in your approach, people will pick that up. Be honest about who you are. If anyone asks, it's okay to make passing references to other issues, like other arguments, like for instance, palliative care. It's okay to make a passing reference to that. It's not okay to make that the central point of your argument. If you make that the central point of your argument, then we are going to lose, because that's actually a very easy argument to knock down. I'm trying to go through this quickly, so I won't go into why, but trust me, the sort of disability rights arguments that John Kelly and our friends here in Connecticut, the Second Thoughts Connecticut, Second Thoughts Massachusetts, the other disability people, those are the arguments that you want to make to defeat assisted suicide. So, obvious, don't deny who you are. Well, aren't you a religious person? Well, yes, I'm a religious person, but even if you are not a religious person, assisted suicide is bad because of X, Y, and Z. Don't deny who you are, but don't get knocked off your talking points. Whenever they try to do that, go right back to your messaging discipline and go back to it over and over and over again, no matter how many times they try to knock you off of it. Okay, fourth point. And again, these points overlap, but I want to emphasize this. We have specific, concrete victims and potential victims of assisted suicide. That's why we've defeated this issue for so many years. Unlike some other issues that we've been involved in, this is not an abstract philosophical argument. You heard it in all the examples, all the actual names that John Kelly gave you. This is a real concrete thing. The people who have either been victims of this or know themselves to be potential victims of this, they can speak to it themselves. They can actually look at the legislators and say, look, if you legalize this, I'm afraid I'm the one who's going to be on the line, that the right to lie will, that the right to die will become a duty to die. Put them out front. Let them say their message. They have a saying, nothing about us without us. Let them speak, because they're the ones that we're advocating for, and nobody can advocate for it better than they can. Our job needs to be to back them up and to be able to give them as much support as we possibly can. That's my fourth point. Fifth point, I want to zero in. You notice when John Kelly was introduced, they gave his title that he holds in two different organizations. One of the two was called Second Thoughts Massachusetts. We have a similar entity here in Connecticut called Second Thoughts Connecticut. That name is very important, Second Thoughts. Why? Because, and this is very heartening. You don't want to let this get you down. You will find sometimes in polling, sometimes when you first approach your friends, you ask them about assisted suicide, they may well be for it. Yeah, why not? We don't want people to die in agony. They don't really know. You're going to find that the support for assisted suicide is a mile wide, but really only an inch deep. And this is where the phrase second thoughts comes in. Most people, when you ask them about assisted suicide, will express some sort of vague support for it. But once you get to talking to them, once you explain to them the sort of things that John Kelly listed, some of the stuff that Alex was talking about, you will find that they have second thoughts. Thus, the name of the group of our allies here in Connecticut and the group in our neighboring state of Massachusetts. That's a very powerful, important thing. Don't let it get you down when you're lobbying and a legislator says, well, I'm for it. Well, that's not the end of a conversation. That's the beginning of a conversation. Oh, really? Are you for it? Have you met my friend John Kelly here in Connecticut? Have you met my friend Kathy Ludlum? You need to put the disability people right out there and say, you need to hear this straight from them. You want to share those arguments yourself, and then you want to bring them in and have them hear it, to borrow a phrase, straight from the horse's mouth, but from our good friends who know this, who understand this firsthand. That's my fifth point. Also, what does that mean, second thoughts? This is very important too. How do we define winning? Well, we define winning by defeating the bill. And that's something you have to understand too. When you're lobbying this thing, you may have legislators who they're still in support of the underlying concept. For whatever reason, they just can't let go of the idea that on some level, they support the concept of assisted suicide. Well, look, this is not an academic exercise. You're not in a classroom. You're not having a philosophical debate. This is lobbying. It doesn't matter that they support the underlying cause. What matters is that you're trying to accomplish the deal. So even when you're speaking to someone who's in favor of assisted suicide, you can still get them to defeat that, to vote no on that bill. That's how we've defeated it over and over again. Our experience is that there are many legislators who are actually favorable, generally favorable to the concept for whatever reason, but they'll say, yes, I support it, but not this bill. This bill doesn't have enough safeguards. And that's the argument you want to make. Oh, really? You support assisted suicide? Well, do you know that this bill has this problem, this problem, this problem? And, you know, I'm going through this quickly, so I'm not laying out all the problems, but you heard it in some of the earlier speeches. You heard all those cases of people ingesting the drugs themselves. There's some question of when it's euthanasia and when it's assisted suicide, and on and on. There's questions about what were the circumstances of some of those deaths. People who are legislators, who are in favor of assisted suicide will still vote against the bill. They will say, I'm in favor of it, but you know, the people who lobbied against this, even though I disagree with them, they have shown me all the weaknesses in this bill. So gosh golly, I may end up voting for an assisted suicide bill someday, I don't know. But this year in this session in this bill, I'm gonna vote no on this bill. That's a win. That's what you're going for. Obviously, we wanna win them all over eventually, ultimately, but just accomplishing that is a huge win. That's why we've been able to defeat this thing for 10 years in Connecticut and all those other states that you heard Alex mention at the beginning. Point number 6, and John Kelly, of course, went into this in great detail. I just want to touch on it briefly. Okay, so we talked about the arguments you don't make, right? Not pro-life versus pro-choice, religion versus secularism, liberal versus conservative. We don't want to be abstract. We want to be very concrete. We want to stay out of the culture war box. How do you do that? You do that by sticking to those disability rights arguments that you heard from John Kelly. What are they? There's 5 big ones. Elder abuse. You heard references to Tammy Sawyer and Thomas Middleton. You can Google these, or actually I'd say look at these PowerPoints that Alex and John have already provided you. But number 1, elder abuse. Number 2, the deadly mix with cost containment. Who's the winner here? The insurance companies. Gee, Grandpa, you're costing us a lot of money. Wouldn't this be easier? I mean, it's a horrible thing. We have actual examples of this happening. And that's the sort of world that you're setting up for our friends in the disability community and for the elderly as well. And we have to get that across. Excuse me, my 15 minutes are up. I'm just going to wrap this up quickly. Elder abuse, deadly mixed with cost containment. Number 3 is a misdiagnosis and incorrect prognoses. And there are a lot of concrete examples of this. Here in Connecticut, they're still claiming that this is only for people with 6 months or less to live who are of sound mind. You already heard about how in other states are expanding it beyond that. But the fact is, we have so many instances where people were wrongly diagnosed. And you can bring all that out to show that, look, that's a totally arbitrary standard. It's utterly phony. And then, so that's the 3rd thing. The 4th thing is suicide contagion. You can't just say, oh, we're gonna separate out this separate thing. If you're 6 months terminal and sound mind, that's somehow not suicide, but these other things are suicide. When you legalize suicide, it sends a message to society. And we have seen actual concrete statistics, evidence where suicide in general goes up in places where it's been legalized. So, and then the 5th thing, and you're going to hear this over and over again, you heard it from John, is disability discrimination. Okay, this is very important. And this ought to be important to our libertarian friends. You know, they may think, oh, well, you know, by legalizing it, we're just getting the state out of assisted suicide. Oh no, my friend, my libertarian friend, you're doing the exact opposite. What you're doing is you just empowered the state to decide different categories of people's lives, who's worth saving and who's not. Some people, we're gonna, if they're suicidal, we're gonna get them suicide prevention. Other people, if they have disability, well, their lives are not, they have lives unworthy of life. There's some German phrase that I don't even know, but that's sort of like, that's the sort of path that we're going down to an earlier, darker era. If we're going to separate out entire classes of people and say, you know, for these other people, if they're suicidal, we'll try to save them, but you, maybe society would be better off without you. that is a very scary place to be, to put the state in charge of that. So those are 5 of the main arguments. There's more having to do with the disability community. What you really want to do is drill down on that argument. And then finally, point number 7 is just some brass tacks regarding lobbying. Write letters to the editor, write op-eds to your local newspaper, form a relationship with your legislator. They will hardly ever be rude to you if you are their own constituent. In fact, they're going to make a mental note. Gee, I'm for assisted suicide, but I heard from this constituent of mine who's opposed to it. They'll make a mental note of your opposition. Participate in the rallies. Testify. And as Alex said, call it what it is. And I'll stop there. Call it assisted suicide. Don't let them get away with not calling it that. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
We've had an excellent evening, and the recording from that first section didn't work out, but the recording from John on has. So I'll be having that uploaded and shared with everyone. Thank you very much. If you go to the EPC USA website, there's an ability to make a donation. EPC USA is a donation-based group, so therefore any donation is possible. Obviously speaking, the same thing holds true for Not Dead Yet or for Second Thoughts. I'd like to thank John for his excellent presentation, and I really wish I hadn't had a frozen screen before he came on. Peter did a phenomenal job. They've been very successful in Connecticut, and they work with a wide group of people in Connecticut, so they've been very successful at leaving their own personal philosophies at the door and working together and keeping assisted suicide out of Connecticut. So thank you very much for this evening, and hopefully we'll do another presentation for you very soon.